If you've read the Gospels at all, you've run into this sentence structure 100 times without noticing it. Jesus is talking, and mid-sentence he switches out of first person. Not, I have nowhere to lay my head. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Not, I have authority to forgive sins. The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He does this constantly, close to 80 times across 4 Gospels, by the count of anyone who's bothered to count. And if you're like most people who've read past this, you've filed it under just a first-century way of talking, a humble little verbal habit, referring to himself in the third person, the way a king might say, "The crown decrees," except softer, more self-effacing. Son of Man. It sounds like the least impressive title available. Not Messiah, not Son of God, not Lord, just a man, somebody's son, human. Here's the problem with that reading. It's the title that got him killed. Not, I am the Son of God, not, I am the Messiah. When the moment comes, the actual moment in the actual trial, where the charge that ends his life gets formally laid, the words that make the presiding judge tear his own robes in fury are built around this exact phrase, the one that sounds humble, the one most of us read as him being modest. Something is wrong with the humble reading. Let's find out what it actually meant.
Here's where the just means human reading comes from, and it's not a bad guess. It's actually well supported, which is what makes this confusing. Go looking for Son of Man anywhere else in the Old Testament, and the place you'll land most often is the book of Ezekiel. God addresses the prophet Ezekiel as Son of Man, in Hebrew, Ben Adam, again and again, not once or twice, over 90 times across the book. Son of Man, stand on your feet, and I will speak with you. Son of Man, eat this scroll. Every single time, it means exactly what it sounds like: mortal, human, dust next to the God who is speaking to him. Scholars who study the phrase are consistent on this point. In Ezekiel, Ben Adam is God's way of keeping the prophet's feet on the ground in the middle of overwhelming visions. You are not divine. You are a son of Adam. Remember what you are. So if Jesus is deliberately picking up Old Testament language, and everyone agrees he is, he's a first-century Jewish teacher steeped in the Hebrew Scriptures, Ezekiel is the obvious well to draw from. 90-plus uses of Son of Man, meaning mortal human being, addressed by God to a person who is explicitly not divine. Read the title against that background, and it lands exactly the way most modern readers take it: Jesus emphasizing his humanity, his humility, his solidarity with ordinary human weakness. Except that reading runs straight into a wall. If Son of Man just means an ordinary human being, why using it at his own trial counts as blasphemy severe enough to warrant a death sentence? Claiming to be a mortal man was never anywhere a capital crime under Jewish law. Something else is happening with this phrase, something the Ezekiel reading can't explain, and something almost every modern reader misses, because Ezekiel really is the first place your instinct sends you.
Here's what actually closes the gap, and it's concrete. There's a second Old Testament text using nearly identical wording, Daniel chapter 7, and the figure described there is not a mortal reminded of his frailty. He arrives riding the clouds of heaven itself, and he's handed something specific: dominion, glory, and a kingdom that every nation on earth is required to serve, one that will never end. There's a real historical record of a title with this exact profile circulating in Jewish thought in the centuries before Jesus. Not vague apocalyptic mood music, but an actual named figure called the Son of Man, described in a specific surviving text as existing before the world was created and hidden with God until the appointed time. And there's a real transcript, as close as we get to one, of the exact 6 words that ended Jesus' trial, recorded independently in 3 of the 4 Gospels, and the reaction of the man who heard them. He didn't ask a follow-up question. He tore his clothes. A second text, a named title with a real paper trail, and an eyewitness reaction on record. Let's take them in order.
Daniel chapter 7 is a night vision. Daniel watches 4 monstrous beasts rise out of a churning sea, one after another, each one representing an empire that will dominate and pass away. Then the scene shifts entirely. Thrones are set up. The Ancient of Days takes his seat, clearly God himself, described in almost blinding terms, clothing white as snow, throne like flames. And then, Daniel 7:13 through 14, this: I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, and glory, and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Read that again, slowly, because every phrase in it is doing work. This figure arrives on the clouds. In the Hebrew Bible, riding the clouds is something God does, not something mortals do. He's presented directly to God's own throne, and what he receives isn't comfort or blessing, it's dominion, glory, and an everlasting kingdom that every nation on earth is required to serve. That is not language the Old Testament uses for an ordinary human being. It's throne room language applied to a figure who shares in God's own authority. Now here's the part almost nobody brings up, and it matters. By the time Jesus is teaching in first-century Galilee, this figure from Daniel 7 had already developed a life of its own in Jewish religious thought. A surviving text called the Similitudes of Enoch, part of a larger Jewish work, 1 Enoch, that circulated widely in this period, even though it never entered the Hebrew canon, describes the Son of Man as a specific, named, transcendent figure, not a metaphor, a real anticipated Redeemer, described as existing before creation itself, hidden in God's presence, waiting to be revealed and to judge the nations. Scholars who study this literature are clear that this text shows the Daniel 7 figure had already crystallized in some Jewish circles as an actual technical title for a heavenly, pre-existent messianic judge, not simply a human being, but something much closer to a divine agent.
So, by the time Jesus starts using this exact phrase about himself, it is not a blank slate. It's a title with 2 live meanings sitting on top of each other. Say Son of Man to someone thinking of Ezekiel, and you sound humble, a mortal, dust, nothing more. Say the same words to someone who knows Daniel 7 and the tradition built on it, and you are claiming to be the figure who rides the clouds into the presence of God and receives an everlasting kingdom that every nation must serve. Same 4 words, 2 completely different claims, depending entirely on which text is loaded in the listener's memory. That ambiguity is not an accident of translation. It's the exact shape of the wordplay Jesus builds his entire public identity around for the length of his ministry. Close to 80 times by any honest count, choosing this phrase over every simpler alternative available to him. Which brings us to the trial and the 6 words that end it. Mark's gospel puts us in the room. Jesus has been silent through most of the proceedings, refusing to answer accusation after accusation, while the high priest grows visibly frustrated. Finally, the high priest asks him directly in Mark 14:61, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?"
the blessed being a reverent Jewish way of avoiding saying God's name directly. It's about as direct a question as could be asked. Are you the Messiah? Are you God's own Son? Jesus answers, Mark 14:62, I am. 2 words, a direct yes. And on their own, those 2 words are serious. Claiming to be the Messiah in the wrong political moment was dangerous, but it was not automatically a capital religious crime. Plenty of would-be messianic figures in this period made that claim and were dealt with as political troublemakers, not blasphemers. Jesus doesn't stop at I am. He keeps talking, and this is the sentence that changes everything. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.
Watch what just happened. He didn't simply confirm the high priest's question. He reached straight past it into Daniel chapter 7, the clouds of heaven, arriving before the throne, receiving authority, and applied every piece of it to himself, in the room, in front of the court that has the power to execute him. Right hand of power is throne room language for sharing directly in God's own authority. Coming with the clouds of heaven is the exact image from Daniel 7:13, word for word. He isn't answering, am I the Messiah, with a simple yes. He's answering it by claiming the throne beside God himself, using the one title in his entire vocabulary, built specifically to carry that claim without ever using the word God. Mark 14:63 through 64 records what happens next in real time. The high priest tears his own garments, a specific ritual gesture of horror at hearing blasphemy, and says, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard the blasphemy. What is your decision?" And the court condemns him as deserving death. He doesn't tear his robes at I am. He tears them after the Son of Man sentence. The high priest, a man whose entire profession was reading scripture, heard Son of Man in that context and understood immediately that Jesus wasn't claiming humility. He was claiming to sit on the throne beside God himself, using the one title in his entire vocabulary built specifically to carry that claim without ever using the word God. Mark chapter 2. A paralyzed man is lowered through a roof to reach Jesus, and Jesus' first words to him aren't about healing at all. "Son, your sins are forgiven." The religious scholars in the room react instantly, and their objection tells you everything about how the phrase was normally understood. Who can forgive sins but God alone? They're right under any normal reading of the law. Forgiving sin was understood as something only God himself could do. And Jesus' response, Mark 2:10, is to say explicitly that he's doing this specifically to prove a point, that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Not I, as a rabbi, forgive sins. The Son of Man has that authority. The same figure from Daniel 7, now exercising the specific prerogative of God alone, on earth, in public.
A few verses later, Mark 2:27 through 28, the Pharisees challenge him over his disciples picking grain on the Sabbath, the day set apart by God's own law in Exodus. Jesus' answer, "The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Not, "I have a flexible view of Sabbath law," Lord of it. The Sabbath belongs to God. Jesus, under this title, claims authority over God's own commandment. And it isn't only about present tense authority. Matthew 24:30, describing what's still to come, "Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." Clouds of heaven, power, glory, the exact vocabulary of Daniel 7:13 and 14, applied again, this time to a future event every nation on earth will witness. forgiving sins reserved for God, lordship over God's own Sabbath, a future arrival on the clouds of heaven with power and glory, 3 separate scenes, 3 separate gospel writers involved across the tradition, and every single time the vehicle carrying the claim is the same quiet-sounding phrase, the Son of Man. This isn't one dramatic moment at the trial. It's a pattern running through the entire ministry, hiding in plain sight inside a title that sounds, on the surface, like the most modest thing he could have called himself. So why this title specifically, rather than simply saying, "I am God," outright, in plain language from the beginning? Consider what each alternative would have cost him. Announcing "I am the Messiah" too plainly, too early, in a land under Roman occupation and thick with real political expectation of a messianic liberator, would have marked him instantly as a revolutionary, the kind of claim that got other messianic figures in this period arrested and executed as insurrectionists before they ever got to explain what kind of king they meant to be. Announcing "I am God" outright to an audience for whom that claim was the single most serious charge in their entire legal and religious system would have ended his public ministry in its first week.
Son of Man did something neither of those could do. To a casual listener, unfamiliar with Daniel 7, it landed softly, an odd but unremarkable way of referring to himself, nothing to report to the authorities. To anyone who knew their Hebrew scriptures deeply, the scribes, the priests, the students of the text who would eventually judge him, it was unmistakable. The claim was there the entire time, fully available to anyone equipped to hear it, and hidden just as completely from anyone who hadn't. Most of us are trained to expect the largest truths to announce themselves loudly. This one didn't. It sat inside a phrase plain enough to be misread for 2,000 years as simple humility, while carrying the entire time a claim to sit on the throne beside God himself. The high priest didn't miss it. He heard exactly what was being said, and it cost Jesus his life within hours.
He used the humblest sounding title available to him to make the largest possible claim, and it's the specific reason we can be certain what he meant to say, because it's the reason they killed him for saying it. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it isn't only a detail about first-century apocalyptic vocabulary. Look back at what actually happened in that room. The full weight of who Jesus claimed to be wasn't delivered in a title so grand that no one could miss it. It was carried inside 4 ordinary-sounding words, available the whole time to anyone who'd done the work of knowing Daniel 7 well enough to hear it, and hidden just as completely from anyone who hadn't. Most of us are trained to expect the largest truths to announce themselves loudly. This one didn't. It sat inside a phrase plain enough to be misread for 2,000 years as simple humility, while carrying the entire time a claim to sit on the throne beside God himself. The high priest didn't miss it. He heard exactly what was being said, and it cost Jesus his life within hours.
If there's a truth on the other side of that, the most significant things aren't always the loudest ones in the room. Sometimes they're sitting inside the plainest sentence available, waiting for someone who knows the text well enough to actually hear it. If you've read past Son of Man 100 times without ever clocking what it actually claimed, that's exactly the kind of gap this channel exists to close. The literal text, the actual background it's drawing from, and what history can and can't confirm about it. Subscribe if you want the next one. Comment which of the 3 parallel scenes surprised you most, and share this with someone who's only ever heard Son of Man explained as Jesus being modest. Thank you for being here. God bless you.